event. So she is one of 4 full-time political science professors here at American River College. It's on? I don't know. Can you hear me? It's still on. I'm Tressa Tabaris. I'm also a political science faculty member here at American River College. And Annie Gilman is our 3rd presenter. There is a 4th political science professor who is not here with us today, but just so you know that who we are. We're going to take some of our presentation in sort of somewhat sequential order, trying to start first with sort of the basics of how it works and think about some of the potential effects of the workings of the Electoral College, and then ending with some thinkings about changes or differences. We want to leave enough time for questions, so we would like you to, if you do have questions, note them down as they arise in your head as you're wondering about things. If we don't ultimately end up getting those questions answered during our presentation, there'll be opportunities to have those open for discussion at the end. So we want to kind of move along and get to those if we possibly can. My experience sometimes is whatever you hear first becomes what sometimes you want to just dig into when we never get to the other stuff. So we're going to try to move ourselves along to get to it all first. I have the honor of going first. With our first sort of segment, which is really just walking us through some of the basic questions about how the Electoral College works. So we sort of lay the foundation for why it's somewhat controversial and why it's sort of somewhat interesting and often raises lots of different kinds of questions in our classrooms, in the media, as we move through. So that's my sort of job, is just to lay that foundation. So this is actually not the Electoral College as a whole. If you notice, this is sort of it looks like a board game. I was thinking it's kind of a fun little board game to say, how would you become president of the United States? And it starts up here with some requirements of how to become president. It goes through a system of primaries and caucuses. We're kind of in that moment right now with the presidential election that would be coming up in 2020, because we're seeing a bunch of Democrats sort of fight it out in that pre-primary cycle. It comes down to the general election, and then finally the final step of this whole process is the Electoral College. So our focus is sort of on this bottom part. What would happen after we know who the Democrats are actually going to name as their candidate and nominee, for example, and we're actually at the stage of having the office of the president be the contest and not the nomination of the political party be the contest. So just sort of putting it in context of where we are. And I decided that there's a lot of things I could talk about, and I can talk forever about some of these topics. So I'm going to narrow my focus to 3 main sort of topics or questions. So the first is, why can a person become president without winning the nationwide popular vote? That's a really common question we hear. And the question is oftentimes asked, isn't that unconstitutional? What happened to my right to vote for president? And so because this is a celebration of Constitution Day, I like to refer to the Constitution. And my first thing to say is it's absolutely not unconstitutional, because you absolutely, as an individual citizen of the United States, have no constitutional right whatsoever to vote for the President of the United States. Bam. Walk out of the room. Mic drop. No. Mic drop. Walk out of the room. It's true. There's nothing unconstitutional at all. And in fact, the Constitution doesn't even say you get to have any say, directly or indirectly, in who the president is as an individual citizen of this country. But we've sort of came to assume that because we've created rules that allow you to have some input. So the state of California allows you to have some input into who the president of the United States become, but not directly. So let me kind of explain. The Constitution of the United States sets the basic groundwork for how we select our president. And in Article 2, Section 1, and this is a quote, so you can write it down if you like, but you can also just go read the Constitution. Okay. It says, each state shall appoint electors, right? So each state government appoints electors, and those electors, right, shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for president and vice president. So the actual constitutional right, the actual constitutional responsibility and authority and power to select the president are from appointed presidential electors, right, that we lovingly have referred to collectively as the Electoral College, right? So the members of the Electoral College are the appointed presidential electors in each of the 50 states of the United States. There are a total, every election cycle, there are going to be a total of 538 of them, because each state gets to appoint electors based on the number of representatives they have in the U.S. House of Representatives and the number of U.S. senators they have, because those are a basis for the population. So if you're a bigger state with more people, you get more presidential electors, you get more votes for president, right? So California gets the most, because we're the biggest, we get 55. We also have, if you've done the math, if you're doing the math in your head, if you've learned about the number of presidential, if you've learned about the number of U.S. House of Representatives members and senators, you're saying those are only 535. So just a little wonkiness too. We added 3 electors for the Federal District of Washington, D.C. It's technically not a state, but it gets to also have a say in who the president is. So collectively, that's the bottom line for how our electoral college system works. States appoint electors, electors vote for president and vice president, and then the person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be president, if that number is a majority. So to be president, you need to win 270 or more of the votes of the presidential electors. So I've not mentioned you at all. So you're not a part of this. You're like, oh man, right? Darn. So then what the heck am I doing, right? What am I voting for when I go to vote on election day in November of 2020? What's the point? What am I doing, right? So that's the second question. What the heck am I voting for? What's going on? I thought it was for the president. They're all on TV talking, right? Why bother to vote if my vote doesn't count? Well, your vote counts. You're just voting for something other than what you might have thought you were voting for. You're not voting for the president of the United States. In California, you're voting for the presidential electors for California, who will then vote for president of the United States. So your vote does count, just counts for something other than what you thought it might have counted for. Right? So there's no such thing as a nationwide vote for president. There's no such thing as a popular vote for president. There is a popular vote for presidential electors, but it's not nationwide. It's in each of the 50 states separately. So you in California are only voting for the presidential electors from California. You don't get to tell Wisconsin what they do. I know we'd like to. They're small, we could just take them over. But you don't get to do that. Just out there, they're only young. Okay. So here's what is said, again, sort of looking at this language. You're voting for presidential electors. That's who you're voting for, right? So it still matters, it still counts. California election code, because you're doing, you're voting in California, and California is allowing you to vote to help it decide how to appoint electors. So California election code, I didn't put the quote there. I didn't want to give you too much legalese. But essentially, what happens is when we know the nominees from the political parties, so after those 20 million Democratic candidates who, once the Democratic Party sorts out who that one presidential nomination is going to be, the parties will list with the state of California, and every state might be a little bit different in exactly what they require, but in California, that party lists the names, addresses, and telephone numbers of 55 electors, because that's how many we have, that have pledged to vote for him or her, right? So every single candidate gets a group of groupies, let's say, right? They get the electors who have all taken a pledge to say, yes, I will vote for you if I'm chosen as an elector, right? And you vote on them together, so there's 55 of them waiting out there. The parties themselves actually determine who's going to be on that list of 55. As you might guess, it's oftentimes people who are very loyal to their party, have been very active for many years. Maybe there's some good donations going on in there somewhere, right? And the parties have a decision to make about who those list of 55 are going to be. But that's what you're voting for, right? So you're like, well, what? I don't know any of those 55 people. They didn't see any campaign ads, right? They didn't tell me that. What's going on? How am I supposed to know who they are? Well, in different states, it might be different. In California, you can find out who they are, right? You can't really necessarily separate them out and say, I want this one elector and not that one elector. You're voting for all 55 together, right? But you can do that. And they vote for president and vice president after they've been appointed based on your general election input. So here's kind of how it works. We hold a general election. That election you go to in November, right, which we call Election Day, and you vote, gets a popular vote, a vote of the people, but you're voting for one of the groups of 55 electors. So you're either voting for the 55 electors, for example, pledged to Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine, or you're voting for the presidential electors who were pledged to vote for Donald Trump and Mike Pence, or any of the other candidates that you're going for. So you get to go, you're voting for them as a group, and you could have, hopefully internet works, it's always my reliance on technology sometimes, right? See if it works. You can actually go and see who they are. So here's the list. There are 55 of them. And there's some rules. You can't be an elector if you're actually already in a government position, a federal government position. So you can't actually be an elector if you're already a member of Congress. But you can be related to the member of Congress and be an elector. So you might notice that name right there, right? Doesn't say Ami Bera, but it says Janine Bera, right? So you can look at this list, and some of them you might not recognize at all, but these were, in fact, the 55 people that Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine, named as their 55 electors. So when you checked a box, if you checked a box that said Clinton Kaine, you weren't voting for Clinton Kaine, you were voting for these people who were pledged to vote. And just to prove that it's not in favor of just Democrats, there's a whole list for the Republicans, right? Donald Trump and Mike Pence have their list. If you kind of look at it, you notice it's different. It's not the same people. It's a different list of 55 people. And if you go through, this is interesting, right? It's a different political party, the American Independent Party, but their electors also pledge for the same candidates, right? Here's the Green Party candidates and their list. I'm going to pause there so you can sort of see. Right. So those are the people that you were voting for. That's what the popular vote went toward. So when you said my vote didn't count, well, it did count, but it didn't count towards the presidents. It counted towards these electors. It's a winner-take-all system in 48 of the 50 states when they have their popular votes. So when we voted in California, whichever group of 55 electors got the most votes from the people, that entire group won and got to be appointed. So that's where we see sometimes the disconnect, because it can be a kind of close outcome, right? The actual people voted, and not everyone voted for the Democratic candidates in California, and yet only the Democratic electors won. So when you look at the popular vote outcome, there's some votes for a Democrat and some votes for a Republican and some votes for a Green. But when you look at the electoral vote outcome, there's only going to be votes for the Democrats. And that's where we see that disconnect. So we get back to that first question. So just to prove, I like documents. Documents are my friend. Evidence is my friend. And because people are kind of like, what? I didn't know that, like, this is all stuff, literally public internet. I just went and created links, right? So this is actually the verification. This is from the 2016 that verifies, right, who the electors were. So it's actually naming how many popular votes those electors got as a group. It's actually naming how many popular votes the Republican electors got as a group. And it's naming how many popular votes the Libertarians got. So you can see, again, these are the popular votes, but the most popular vote was for the Democrats, so that's the 55 that won. And one last little bit, right? On election day, again, right, the next part is, so we now have electors. And the actual true presidential election day, if we want to call it that, is when the electors actually go and cast their votes for president and vice president, right? So that happens in December, happens in the first week of December. So between when you voted in November, if there's really close outcomes, sometimes there are, not so much in California, but in some other states where it's considered a battleground state, there might be a delay, right, where the media declares who the winner are, but officially they might still be counting votes. And they have up until election day in December to actually figure out who those rightful electors are to vote. And then on election day in California, those 55 people that the people voted for, they show up at the Capitol. So they come to Sacramento and they officially declare who their votes are. So it's even though it feels automatic because on election night they're announcing all the details, it's not official until this happens. And then they actually vote and they certify their vote. So they say, we, the undersigned electors for president and vice president, they're declaring who they're voting for, right? And in California, they voted, all 55 of them were faithful to their pledge, right? And they all voted for Hillary Clinton for president, and they all voted for Tim Kaine for vice president, and then they all signed, right? So this is the official ballot that California submitted for its votes for president and vice president. And this happens in all 50 states in sometimes slightly different ways. But that's how the process actually works. So the reason why you can have a disconnect between the popular vote and the actual outcome of those electoral votes happens right here in the middle, that winner take all. The magic and the fact that there's never any nationwide voting. It's all happening in the 50 states separately. And lastly, I'll leave you with our little map here that shows us the 2016 electoral vote results, right? We know that overall nationwide, Trump got enough votes. He got more than 270 of the electoral votes, and so he was declared the winner as president, and Mike Pence was declared the winner as vice president. And you can see that we do count states somewhat holistically when we talk about the winner-take-all outcome, but in this case, there were some instances where electors in some of the other states, and you can see, voted for other candidates. They used that vote as presidential elector, right? And it's not very common that we see that. We often see them all being very faithful to their pledge, but in this case, there were some others that happened. And so just to show you that they do actually go, and each individual elector does in fact cast a vote. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Anna. And she can get rid of my stuff.
And I am going to magically, let's see, I'm going to escape you. Yeah. Not escape you in that.
You can just close it.
I just want to go over here. Okay. So I'm Cindy Mack, political science professor here at American River College. First of all, I want to thank you for coming, taking some of your time out of your busy day to join us for this Constitution Day presentation. My task is to talk a little bit about some of the criticisms about the Electoral College, right? Just because it's in the Constitution, which is a document that we tend to revere and like, doesn't mean that we have to like it, right? And a lot of people don't like the Electoral College, and there have been historically a lot of criticisms of the Electoral College. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about basically 4 general criticisms of the Electoral College, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Gilman, who will talk about, well, if we don't want the Electoral College, what can we do about it? So that's where we're headed here. So I'm going to talk about 4 things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the argument that the Constitution, that the Electoral College thwarts the will of the majority, sometimes. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what we call faithless electors, which in the previous slide that Professor Tabares showed, you could see that some of the people who were pledged to vote for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump did in fact not vote for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. We call those faithless electors. The third thing I want to talk about is the argument that the Electoral College violates the one-person, one-vote rule, and I'll talk about what that is and why people make that argument. Oops, that I did not want to do. Look what I did. Look at how Clive slides and everything. I was going to go from one to the other, and then I couldn't figure out how to make that work. So, and then the last thing that I want to talk about is the argument that the Electoral College encourages candidates to focus most of their attention on just a few states instead of campaigning all across the country, and maybe makes people feel left out. But the first thing I want to talk about is the argument that the Electoral College thwarts the will of the majority. So this political cartoon is essentially pointing out the fact that even though Hillary Clinton won the nationwide, if you add up all of the people who voted in the 2016 election and you count up all the votes that were cast, Hillary Clinton actually got more votes than Donald Trump did. But because the Constitution doesn't even account for a popular vote, that number doesn't matter. What matters is who wins and by how much you win in a state. And so the way the Electoral College is set up, a candidate can win the popular vote but lose the election. And it's happened 5 times in our history, including twice in the last 20 years, the election of 2000 and the election of 2016. And so that's one of the criticisms of the Electoral College, is that the person who gets the most votes doesn't win the election. And it's sort of the only election that we have in the United States. Usually, if you win the most votes, you get the seat or you get the position within the government. And so that's one of the criticisms of the Electoral College. I want to I have the exact same slide as Professor Tabares. We've been teaching together for a long time. Yeah, I can't remember where I got it. But the other problem that people have, criticism that people have with the Electoral College, I left off I should have closed my quote there, is the problem of the faithless elector. So theoretically, when the people in each state vote, they're voting for people who have kind of promised to vote the way they're told to vote. So if we vote for you, you should vote the way we think you're going to vote. And like 99% of the time, that's exactly what happens. And the electors are faithful. They vote for the candidate they're supposed to vote for. But 167 times in our history, individual electors have voted for somebody other than the candidate they were pledged to vote for. And it's never changed the outcome of an election. We've never had a person get elected president because of faithless electors, but it does reflect the constitutional notion that it is the electors who choose the president and the electors who choose the vice president. And just because we get a say in who those electors are, we don't actually control who they vote for. There are 30 states, plus the District of Columbia, that actually require their electors to vote the way they're supposed to. And so an elector who breaks faith with the voters in their state might get fined. They might get in trouble with the government. But ultimately, their vote is the vote that counts for president. And I actually was kind of surprised when I was doing I know a lot about the Electoral College, but when we do presentations like this, I always like to try and learn something new. I'm a student in that sense. I like to learn new things. And one of the things that I found when I was doing some legal research is that the United States Supreme Court has never definitively ruled on whether or not a state could deny a faithless elector the vote that they cast. They've implied it in some of their Supreme Court decisions that it's ultimately the intent of the framers of the Constitution was that the electors would be independent, that the electors would be free to use their own best judgment as to who should be president and who should be vice president. And so even if a state really wanted to crack down on faithless electors, it's possible that if this ever came before the Supreme Court might reinforce this notion that the electors are the ones who choose the president, not the people voting in the states. And I just wanted to give you, because I like to learn things, so I was sharing this with Professor Bethel a little bit earlier. I looked up all of the faithless electors who have ever been faithless electors historically, and there are actually some kind of interesting stories. So for example, I always do this, my poor students, I do this, I get ahead of my PowerPoints, so let me okay, no, I'm not ahead of my PowerPoint. So I want to give you a couple of examples of faithless electors. So in 2016, you can see that these people got votes for president even though they were not the party's candidates. So Colin Powell, I believe, got 3 votes. Rand Paul got a vote. A Native American leader named Spotted Eagle got a vote. John Kasich got a vote. Bernie Sanders got a couple of votes. It didn't change the outcome of the election, but it just goes to show you that the electors are the ones who vote for president. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of where this has happened historically. So in the presidential election of 1872, the Democratic Party nominated a guy by the name of Horace Greeley for president. And the voters voted, and Horace Greeley won the popular vote in some states. He didn't win the election. He wasn't going to be president, but he was going to get some electors. And then he died. He died before the electors voted. And 63 electors refused to vote for a dead guy. And so they split their vote amongst a bunch of other Democratic candidates for president. And then in another election, which I don't want to look up because it takes too much time, the Democratic Party nominated a guy for vice president who, I was going to say pissed off, he angered the electors from the state of Virginia, and they refused to vote for him for vice president. They refused to cast their ballot for him for vice president because he allegedly lived with an African American woman. So they punished him by withholding their vote. So there's lots of interesting stories in our history of why an elector might decide to vote for somebody else. So that's another one of the criticisms of the Electoral College, this faithless elector. The other criticism this is actually a really important concept in American politics and in American law, this one person, one vote principle. It's the idea that everybody's vote should count equally toward an election outcome. So when you go to vote for a member of the House of Representatives, your vote should count just as much as somebody who's voting in San Diego or somebody who's voting in Texas. That nobody's vote should count more because they're more educated or because they're wealthier or because they're more politically powerful. Everybody's vote is supposed to count equally. But the Electoral College, and it's not unconstitutional that it does this because the Electoral College is set up in the Constitution itself, but the Electoral College does not treat every voter's vote the same from state to state to state. And the reason for that is because each state gets electors based on the number of seats they have in Congress. So California has 53 seats in the House and 2 senators. So we have 55 electoral votes. Wyoming, which only has a population of like 600,000 people, they only have 1 seat in the House of Representatives, but they get 2 US senators just like California does. So if you do the math right? The 30-something million people who live in California versus the 600,000 people who live in Wyoming. Each elector in Wyoming represents about 200,000 people. Each elector in California represents about 700,000 people. So even though California casts a lot of votes for president, our electors, there's 55 of them, each of those electors represents more voters. So your individual vote in California isn't as powerful as an individual vote in Wyoming. And some people don't like that. I should say, in the interest of fairness, mostly Democrats don't like this because the high population states tend to be more Democratic. So that's the third thing. And then the last thing is that because some states are what we call safe states, from election to election to election, the outcome doesn't usually change. The voters in that state vote for the candidate from the same political party, right? So California is generally a reliably Democratic state. Texas may be changing. Some people like to talk about Texas becoming more purple. But right now, Texas is a fairly reliable Republican state. New York is a fairly reliable Democratic state. And what ends up happening is that there's just a handful of states where the outcome of the election can't really be predicted with any kind of accuracy. So if you're a candidate running for president, you're going to be very strategic about how you spend your campaign money and how you spend your campaign time. And as a result of that, there are some states that get a disproportionate amount of attention in the election because those are the states where the outcome isn't as certain. We call those battleground states. We sometimes call them swing states. And the candidates spend a lot of their time there, which might make people in California feel a little bit left out. The candidates like to come here to raise money, but then they don't usually come here and do very much campaigning. So they're not knocking on your door. They're not, talking to you at the supermarket grand opening. In the 2016 election, just as an example, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton spent 90% of their campaign time in 11 states. 2/3 of that time was spent in just 4 states. And so Ohio gets a lot of attention, Florida gets a lot of attention, North Carolina, Pennsylvania were the 4 that they spent most of their time in. So some of the criticisms of the Electoral College are based on the way it's structured and the way it operates under state law, having to do with this winner-take-all system, having to do with the way the electors are allocated in such a way that the popular vote winner doesn't necessarily win, and the way it can concentrate attention into just a few states rather than the country as a whole. So those are some of the criticisms of the Electoral College. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Professor Gilman, and she's going to talk about some of the proposals that have been made to either change or abolish the Electoral College if we wanted to do something different.
Great. Oh, thank you. You guys get double extra credit. Good job. Good job. Thanks for coming. All right. So if you're from my class, you know we're very participatory, right? So I'm going to try. Yes, there you go. Thank you. Good job. Good job, Thomas. All right. So I'm going to try and sell you on some new ideas for changing the Electoral College. And one is a national popular vote. Now, you're probably going to say to me, but wait, it's hard to change the Constitution. If you're in my class, you'll be like, we know it's hard to change the Constitution, right? But I have a better idea for you guys. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Here's how it works. A bunch of states with a lot of electoral votes get together and they say, let's make a deal, okay? Now, we will cast all of our electoral votes for whichever candidate wins the popular vote. Okay, I'm going to say that again. So we, California, say, we promise that we will give all of our electoral votes, all 55 of them, to the candidate who wins the popular vote, right? And we say, what do you think, Rhode Island, you win. New York, you win. Massachusetts, you win. And we create an interstate compact that says, if we can get to 270, if we can get enough states to commit to do this, 270, which is what it would actually take to win, we have effectively created a national popular vote. This is a real thing, actually. 15 states plus the District of Columbia have vowed to do this, and they're up to 196 electoral votes. So some 73% on their way to that 270, okay? There's one idea I want to sell to you guys. How many people think this is an awesome idea? How many people are in? All right, Piper and Chase, thank you very much. Very good. How many people say, no way, we're not in? Thomas, great. David. Oh, David, I'm not going to. You know the joke, David. David knows the joke. All right, you're out, Andrew. Nobody likes that idea. All right, I got a new idea for you guys. Another idea. Okay. It's called proportional electorates, okay? Proportional electorates. So we got 55, right? Right now we have a winner-take-all system. If you get 50.0000%, of the votes here in California, actually, even if you just get a plurality, right? If you get 48, somebody else gets 5, somebody else gets 47, you get all the electoral votes. So what if we have a system where you get the proportion of electoral votes that is equivalent to the proportion of the votes that you got in the state, right? So you get 50% of the votes in the state, you get 50% of our electoral votes. You get 75%, you get 75%. How many people like that idea? Thomas likes it. David likes it. Good. Jason likes it. Okay, now I have a question for you. First of all, how many people in California think we should do that just by ourselves, not with any other states? We're going to do it no matter what. We'll play by these rules, but you can play by different rules if you want. No. Why not? What might be the problem if other people are playing by different rules? So, blue California, if you are a blue Democrat in blue California, right, and, red Texas is playing by the rules where they're not doing proportional. They're going to give all of their electoral votes to whoever wins the majority in their state, and we're just going to give a proportion of ours, right? We're giving up an advantage, right? So think about this again. And now I want you to vote pretending you're somebody or not, okay? Let's go back to the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, the idea that we're going to try and get enough states together to decide that, we don't even need a constitutional amendment. We're just going to get this thing done as states, and we're going to create a national popular vote. All right. You are a diehard Democrat living in California. How do you vote? What do you think about this National Popular Interstate Compact? You're for it, right? Why? Because who would be president right now? Hillary Clinton, right? Who got more than 2 million more votes, right? Who would have been president in 2000? Gore, right? Who would have been president in 1876? I think it was Hayes, right? It's been a while. There you go. Thank you, right? All right. You are a diehard Republican in California. How do you feel about this national popular vote? Don't do it. Don't do it. How about you are a member of a swing state? You're an independent in a swing state. How do you feel about the national popular vote? No, you like this power. You like getting a lot of attention from these candidates, right? How about proportional votes? How about if you're a diehard Democrat in California? Don't do it. Not until everybody else does, right? How if you're a diehard Republican in California? How do you feel about these proportional votes? Thomas he's ready to campaign for this, right? Right. So as it turns out, the Electoral College is controversial in part because there are partisan advantages or disadvantages right now that come with any sort of change to the Electoral College. But in fact, we do have a national popular vote interstate compact. It's not up to the 270 votes that would be needed to make it an actual legal compact. So until we get to those 270 votes, it doesn't kick in. But they're at 196. And some states do a form of proportional casting their votes, right? So if you are in Maine, for example, the number of seats won in the House of Representatives is the number of votes that go to the electoral, a number of electoral votes that go for one party or the other, right? So they do split those electoral votes. And if you get the majority, the popular majority in Maine, the 2 Senate votes also go toward that presidential candidate. So we are moving in, we have experimentation around the Electoral College actually in place right now, even though it is still a constitutional guarantee. Okay, we'll leave it for questions now.
Thank you very much. Thank you.